Why don't we get going here? Welcome everybody, I'm Tom Zinnan. I work at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. Also work for the Division of Extension, and on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, PBS Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, thanks again for coming to Wednesday night at the lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year by Zoom. Next week is, let's see, today is November. Kendall, do you remember who we have on for next week? I'm drawing a blank.
No, I'd have to check.
Okay, well, if you can check the lineup, that'd be excellent for next week. And then we'll be dark on November 25th. That's the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. On December 2nd, we've got Lennon Rogers from the College of Engineering is going to talk about some of the engineering innovations he's been working on with his colleagues in the era of COVID. And then on December 9th, Jeff Sindelar from the Department of Animal and Dairy Sciences will be here to talk about their new meat science and animal biologics discovery building on campus. So that's the lineup we can look forward to. And now I'll get to introduce you to our speaker tonight. I'm really delighted to be able to have Gregg Jamison here because of the work that he does. And today is November 11th. It's Veterans Day. Used to be Armistice Day. It's a good day to remember people who have fought and served in wars. And tonight we'll be talking about finding the remains of people who have died and their bodies weren't recovered. Gregg, I'm going to ask you the 5 questions. Where were you born?
I was born in Edina, Minnesota.
Whoa, hockey.
Indeed.
And where'd you go to high school?
I went to high school at Rosemount High School, a suburb of the Twin Cities.
And where'd you go for your undergrad and what did you study?
I went to UW-La Crosse for my undergrad. As soon as I graduated high school, I moved to Wisconsin. I went to La Crosse because they have a standalone bachelor's of archaeological science degree, and that's what I wanted to do. So I left Minnesota when I was 18, and I have never left Wisconsin ever since.
There you go. And where'd you go for your master's and PhD?
Both at Madison. After I finished my undergrad at La Crosse, I spent a couple years working, doing archaeology, and then I decided I wanted to go back to grad school. So I did my master's and PhD in anthropology at UW-Madison.
What was your PhD research on?
My PhD research was on the Indus civilization, one of the first urban civilizations in human history. The archaeological remains are in India and Pakistan.
Very nice. And then how long have you been working for UW-Milwaukee?
I started at UW, what at the time was UW-Waukesha in 2016, and then in 2018, UW-Waukesha became UW-Milwaukee at Waukesha, and that's where I've been ever since.
Very good. Tonight you get to talk with us about the UW Missing in Action Recovery and Identification Project and the archaeological approaches to recovery missions in Europe. So if everybody please join me in welcoming Gregg to Wednesday night at the lab, I'd appreciate it. And Gregg, you can take it away anytime now.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you all for attending. I'm very excited to talk about the UW-MIA project. I'm going to be focusing primarily on archaeological approaches to recovery missions. That's my background and area of expertise. I do want to warn all of you that I'm in my dungeon basement, and sometimes my Wi-Fi connectivity isn't the greatest, although I tried boosting it a little bit, so hopefully we won't have any problems. And also, full disclosure, I've already had 4 online classes today. This is my 5th time talking on Zoom or something like it today, so my voice is a little tired, but I've got a giant bottle of water, so hopefully I can power through. Before I get started, I would like to recognize veterans, all armed services veterans on Veterans Day. And on behalf of the UW-MIA team, I'd like to take a moment to recognize all of you and all veterans everywhere across the world for their service, commitment, and sacrifices for our country. You inspire us, are a big part of what we do, what we want to do, why we want to do what we try to do through this project. You're all heroes, and I'd especially like to take a moment to recognize all of our current and former team members who are either veterans or active duty service members. Thank you all very much. I also want to make sure to recognize and acknowledge our partners in the DPAA, who I will talk more about momentarily, and everybody who has been involved with the UW-MIA Recovery and Identification Project. We are a team composed largely of volunteers, many of whom are students, others of whom are professionals in and outside of the UW system. And I'd like to thank everybody who's helped us do what we do. There's too many people to mention by name here. I'll just point out here that a lot of our leadership is students, faculty, and staff from UW-Madison. And I'd also like to thank Tom Zinnan and everybody else who organizes this for inviting me to present tonight. I'm, as I said, very happy to be here. There are over 80,000 known USA Missing in Action members. Many of them come from World War II. And the UW-MIA project is a partnership with the DPAA to try to find and bring them home. Our project is goal-oriented, multidisciplinary, combining both archaeology with forensic and biological anthropological approaches, research methods, along with history, genealogy, and hopefully in the future, biology and genetics as well. The DPAA stands for the Defense POWIMIA Accounting Agency. A link to their website is here, and I will reference this again at the end of the presentation. This is an agency within the Department of Defense that is charged with fulfilling our nation's promise to provide the fullest possible accounting of missing armed service personnel to their families. We have had a partnership with the DPAA since 2016 to conduct recovery missions to find, identify, and repatriate the remains of missing American service members in Europe from World War II. Our team is comprised of volunteers. And as I said, we have a lot of different people who participate. We've got teachers, professors throughout the UW system, other professionals from the UW system and beyond, and especially students. A lot of our most valuable team members are students, all of whom are volunteers and routinely find ways to participate and contribute to what we do in spite of their busy schedules. A lot of them work outside of school and go to school full time. So again, there's too many people here for me to mention and discuss by name. The only thing I want to point out right now is that Charles Chuck Konsinski is our fearless leader. Without him, none of this would be possible. Most of you, I'm assuming, are already familiar with Chuck. You know who Chuck is, and you might be interested to see how happy he looks in this picture on the upper left of the screen here. Chuck is definitely in his happy place when we are on our recovery missions. Our efforts to date have helped bring 3 heroes home, the remains of 3 heroes home, including PFC Lawrence Gordon, First Lieutenant Frank Fazekas, and Second Lieutenant Walter Stone. Our first case or partnership with the DPAA actually began before we started doing recovery missions. In the summer of 2014, the Biotechnology Center got involved in the analysis and identification of the remains of PFC Lawrence S. Gordon. It's a fascinating backstory. This was well before I was involved with the project, but PFC Gordon was killed in action in August of 1944, originally buried as an American unknown, Later, his remains were reinterred as a German soldier. And then in 2014, those remains were tested at the Biotechnology Center, and DNA analysis confirmed that they were indeed the remains of PFC Gordon, and this is where the partnership with the DPAA was first established. Our first recovery mission took place in the summer of 2016, and it involved the case of First Lieutenant Frank Fazekas, was killed in action in May of 1944 in France when his P-47 aircraft was shot down. The first recovery mission was conducted over 2 seasons of excavation that were supervised by Dr. Leslie Eisenberg, a world-renowned forensic anthropologist, with the assistance of Dr. William Bill Belcher, who formerly worked for the DPAA as a forensic archaeologist and also happens to be an old friend and colleague of mine. We had the same graduate school advisor. I was not on the project, of course. This was before my involvement, so I can't tell you too much about what the archaeology was like, but I've heard enough about it and heard enough stories to be able to inform you that the site was located in an agricultural field on private property. It was not easy to find. It was not easy to excavate. There were 2 seasons of, at times, very, very difficult excavations. They had to deal with rain. They had to deal with difficult soil conditions, very, very dense clay that Chuck has described to me on multiple occasions. At some point, it was like trying to cut through wet peanut butter, which really does not, as an archaeologist, sound very fun to me at all. But it was a success by any measure. Not only was the team able to successfully relocate the crash site, which had been largely buried and refilled through subsequent agricultural practices, but they were also able to excavate it. They recovered materials that correlated this particular crash site with the crash incident and the individual that they were looking for. And they ultimately were able to recover some of his remains, repatriate them to his family. And this was our first successful recovery mission. I joined in the late spring of 2018 as the lead archaeologist and scientific recovery expert for the project. I had no background in doing this kind of work or research before. As I mentioned at the beginning, my academic research background is in the origins of city, states, and civilizations. And a lot of my PhD fieldwork took place in India and Pakistan. So I didn't have any background doing this kind of work before, but I was recommended after the former SRE, Dr. Eisenberg, was no longer able to continue or participate in the 2018 recovery mission because of my experience and background in what's called cultural resource management. This is essentially contract and compliance archaeology, which I've been doing now for 20 years. And so I was recommended to Chuck Kaczynski on the basis of my experience doing this from several colleagues that I know. He took a chance on me, I took a chance on the project, and it ended up being the smartest decision I've ever made in terms of actually doing archaeology. It's the most challenging, but without a doubt, most rewarding experience of my archaeological career. And in addition to being so rewarding to me personally, it also represents a fairly unique approach to actually doing archaeology and provides valuable opportunities and experiences for us to teach, especially our student volunteers. I want to spend most of the rest of this talk discussing how we actually go about doing our recovery missions, what some of our archaeological approaches and methods are. And in some ways, what we do on our recovery missions is very similar. It's very comparable to what people do on other types of archaeological research projects, academic archaeological research, for example. We use a variety of different fairly standard field methods. We conduct surveys to try to locate areas of interest where we might want to do excavations. We conduct excavations with a variety of different tools. I'll talk more about that in a few moments. The soils that we excavate or are excavated, removed from the earth, are sifted. And the point of doing that is to try to recover material culture or other materials that we're interested in trying to find. And then, of course, we analyze those as well. This is fairly standard archaeological practice. We also document very methodically everything that we do. In fact, a lot of what I do when we're on these projects is documentation. So, you know, we take very, very detailed notes. We make maps. We take lots and lots of photographs. We count, record, and analyze all of the materials that we recover. And this is also standard practice in archaeological research. And the simple reason for that is because once you dig a site, it's gone. You can't just put it all back together. Once it's out of the ground, once it's out of the earth, it's gone. And so making sure that we document everything that we do meticulously and carefully is important so that we have detailed records for after we're finished. Having said all that, in other ways, this project and our approach to these recovery missions is fairly distinct and in some ways unique than a lot of other archaeological research projects. And there's a couple ways I can point to that kind of demonstrate this. The first is that we have usually very, very specific time constraints. We usually have a couple weeks to try to get one of these recovery missions done. Since our team is comprised of volunteers that are either students or other professionals, we don't have the luxury of being able to go and do excavations for months at a time. And in some ways, that makes it more challenging. In other ways, I think it doesn't end up being that big of a problem. It's really difficult to go on an excavation for 3 months, to be away from home, to be away from your family. So these time constraints end up being, they kind of end up being a mixed bag. It's some good and some not so great. We also have a tendency to rely heavily on machines to help us conduct our excavations. This is both a reflection of the fact that we have time constraints, and also the nature or the character of some of the archaeological sites that we do our excavations on. If you're going to an aircraft crash site where there is a great big giant crater or hole in the ground, it can be extremely difficult and in some cases even dangerous to be able to dig that out by hand, even if you do have the luxury of having plenty of time to do it. So we use machines to aid and assist in our excavations for a variety of different reasons. The third way that these recovery missions are different than a lot of other archaeological research projects are that we don't have a lot of opportunities for post-field work analysis. After the conclusion of our recovery missions, all of the materials that we recover are ultimately transferred back to the DPAA. They have a central identification laboratory in Hawaii and a team of world-renowned experts who do most of the analysis of the materials that we recover. And so that's also a bit different than a lot of other archaeological research projects. This is a good example of what I would call applied archaeology, which is the use of archaeological research and data to solve real-world problems. We are not conducting these recovery missions to try to learn about what was happening, you know, with a group of people that we don't have any connection to 3,500, 4,000 years ago. We're not out trying to find new sites or to gather information to learn about what was happening deep in the past. We are doing this for a very specific purpose, to try to find, recover, and repatriate the remains of missing MIA Armed Services personnel. It's a great use of archaeological knowledge, archaeological skills, and it also provides unique learning and volunteer opportunities, especially for our students who come from a wide variety of different personal and academic backgrounds. And I'll talk more about that toward the end of the presentation as well. I'm going to pause just momentarily to get a drink of water. Please excuse me. And then after that, I'd like to spend some time giving you a comparison of two of the recovery missions that I've been on. I'll focus specifically on variation and differences in the cases, in the sites, some differences in our approaches, And then I'll also reflect on some of the similarities, very similar goals, comparable methods, and of course, in both cases, we rely extensively on our hardworking volunteers. Okay, so let's start with my first case in the summer of 2018. My first case was to search for and try to recover the remains of Second Lieutenant Walter Stone, who was killed in action in October of 1943 near Quercamps, France, when his P-47 aircraft was shot down by enemy fire. The site had already been previously located, and partial excavations had been done the previous season by the DPAA, which was very beneficial for us in as much as we knew right where we needed to go. We had very good records about the history of the case and even good idea of how we were going to approach our recovery mission. The site itself was a single impact crater from where the plane had crashed. It was located in a fairly dense but managed national forest in northern France. Lots of mature trees, but and some undergrowth. But as I said, it was managed, so we were able to easily access the site. There were good forest track roads. We were able to park within a reasonable distance, and then we would go to and from the site every day. The site had been partially excavated, as I mentioned, the prior year, and there was also evidence of post-depositional activities, so post-site activities and other activities that had partially disturbed the site. Our team in 2018 was comprised of 9 hardworking, incredible volunteers and 1 confused, worried is an understatement. When I first started this, I was terrified and on most days utterly filthy, but ultimately extremely happy archaeologist. Here's a picture of our team along with some of our local hosts. Very supportive community. Everybody that we met and interacted with while we were there was extremely friendly and supportive of what we were doing. And I think a big part of the reason for that is because World War II is still vivid in the minds, hearts, and memories of many people who live in this part of the world. Our project and goals for the 2018 recovery mission were actually fairly straightforward. We were going to survey the site, excavate in and around the impact crater, screen all of the excavated soils to recover any potential remains or other materials associated with the site, and then of course to try to recover and bring home the remains of Second Lieutenant Stone. And you can see here in the image on the bottom of the screen, or the bottom of the slide here, what I mean hopefully by screening all of the excavated soils. So whenever we would excavate soil, we would carry it usually by hand in buckets over to one of several of these stations where we had these large wooden box screens. And that's where we would put all of the excavated soil, and then you shake them and sift through them to try to recover any potential materials associated with our case. The first thing we did upon arrival was to try to relocate the site, and especially the site datum. A site datum in archaeological terms is simply a reference point. It's usually a fixed location somewhere on the landscape that you can then tie back in to something else, and it's primarily valuable for mapping and recording purposes. Since the DPAA had been there the previous season, as I mentioned a few moments ago, it was very easy for us to relocate the site and also relocate the site datum. That didn't take us much time at all. After that, since it had been an entire year since the DPAA had been there, in fact, I think even a little bit longer, our next task was to remove a lot of the surface vegetation and some of the trees that surrounded the crater with the permission of the local authorities and agencies that managed the forest that the site was in. And that was also largely done by hand. So the image you see on the left here is what the site looked like when we arrived. And then the one on the right is what it looked like after we had largely gotten it cleaned up. This was a physically demanding process, of course, but fortunately it didn't take that much time. After that, we got the area cleaned up. We conducted what's called a pedestrian survey, which is just systematically kind of walking, usually at fixed intervals and rows, to try to reestablish the site boundary, the site perimeter, and then look for any additional materials that might be associated with the crash and the site in and adjacent to the impact crater, which you can see pretty clearly, especially in the image on the right. After that, our next step was to create a machine access corridor. A lot of the excavations here were done with the machine, and because this was in a forest and we did not want to bring in a big machine and have it potentially damage anything on the site, we had to create a sterile area where we could demonstrate that there was nothing buried that was associated with the site. And that was how the machine ultimately came in. We also created areas to stockpile the soil that was going to be excavated. And we want to be very careful when we're doing this because we don't know if there are remains of the MIA buried in the ground. We don't know if there are other potentially valuable materials or remains associated with the individuals we're looking for buried under the ground. And we don't just want to bring in a big backhoe and have them potentially run over or damage items that are buried in the ground that we're interested in. So that took a little bit of time and some planning to do. After that, we removed all of the backfill, all of the soil from the previous season's excavations. And then after that, we created an excavation grid. When we do excavations, what we'll usually do is create a standardized grid system. DPAA has a great way of doing this. We basically created big squares. And then we excavated those one at a time, each one with its own unique numbering system. And the reason why we do that is it provides a very simple and effective way for us to keep track of where the things we recover are coming from. This is another crucial aspect of doing archaeological research, keeping track, of space and place, where at a site we find things, how deep in the ground they are, so on and so forth, is extremely important. So we set up a grid so that we could control our excavations, and then we created a map, what we call a plan map, which also included previous excavations from the DPAA the season before, and some other topographic features that were relevant, trees and forest track roads as well. After that was done, we spent the majority of the rest of our time conducting the excavations. We started our excavations on the outside of the crater and then worked our way in. Outside of the crater, there was what we call an impact berm. That's basically kind of a little mound or pile of soil on the rim of the crater that either would have been from getting thrown out when the plane crashed, or in some cases that's from previous or post-incident activities as well. First, we dug by hand. And then eventually we brought in a machine, which you can see pictured on the bottom of the right. The machine was very valuable for stripping away large blocks of soil that ultimately allowed us to get all the way down to the bottom of the impact crater, which is what you see on the upper left. And then we dug that out by hand. We were very fortunate to have a highly skilled machine operator do most of the excavations for us. Unfortunately, he literally did not speak any English, which is not surprising considering where we were. But we were fortunate to have, as a volunteer on our team, a very, very skilled, highly effective translator, who's pictured at the bottom of the slide here, Mrs. Erin Hoffman. And she was a very valuable asset to our mission that year. We excavated until we got into sterile soils. What that means is we dug until we could demonstrate that we were beyond, beneath, and past any soils that might have any evidence of the crash anymore. We did so following DPAA protocols. We did all of the excavations following DPAA protocols. They have very, very good, clearly articulated protocols for how to conduct these recovery operations. As I mentioned a few moments ago, all of the excavated soils were screened at these portable screening stations, which you can see pictured here on the right. This is one of our team's kind of innovations. We had some very clever handymen on the team, including Chuck. And so they would build these A-frames, which you can see here, and then we would be able to suspend a series of these screens, which are basically wooden boxes with 1/4-inch mesh at the bottom of them. And then we would haul all of the excavated soil to these in buckets. And then that would be where we would recover all of the materials that we were looking for. When we finally got to the bottom of the crater, we profiled it, or we bisected it, which is what you see on the upper left image here. And that was all excavated by hand. And then when we got to the bottom of that, we also created another series of maps. What do we do with the materials that we actually recover? Well, anything that is potentially probative, in other words, anything we recover that might correlate or associate with the individual whose remains we're looking for, are analyzed in the field. And if they are determined to have any probative value whatsoever, then they are sent to the DPAA for further analysis. What we largely do while we're in the field is document, make preliminary field assessments, and then we send everything else on to the DPAA. Other types of material that we encounter during these excavations that are fairly common include various types of and quantities of wreckage from the aircraft, what we call aircraft wreckage, or ACW, and that is generally counted and sorted, but is not probative and therefore doesn't usually go back to the DPAA. What did we find? Well, we found the remains of 4 of the machine guns from the plane. They did not have serial numbers on them anymore that we could make out, but we're reasonably confident that they were associated with our aircraft. We found lots of ammunition. Most of it had been spent or cooked off, presumably during the crash. We found some safety equipment. We found some fabric, possibly from the pilot's seat or other equipment. And then we did find some biological remains as well, including possible human remains. All of that material was sent to the DPAA laboratory, and in late February of 2019, the DPAA confirmed through biological analysis of some of the material that we had sent back to their lab, in combination with some biological material that their own team had recovered the previous year, that the remains, at least some of them at this site, did indeed belong to Second Lieutenant Stone. So this was another successful mission for the partnership between the UW-MIA and the DPAA, and it was my first, and the fact that we were successful was one of the happiest moments of my career. And all it really made me want to do was go do this more. And so fortunately, we were able to start on another case in 2019, in the summer of 2019. The case is ongoing. I can't tell you any details about it, any specifics. I can only give you a little tease. I'll tell you that it involves the loss of a much larger aircraft that went down in southern Belgium in late 1944. And of the significantly larger crew, 1 crew member is still unaccounted for, missing in action. And so that was the person that we were going to try to recover. Unlike the Stone case, DPAA had not done extensive previous excavations here before, but they had done archival research and sent out a team to do some survey. And that had indicated that this was a very large site with a single, possibly 2 impact craters that were spread over 2 privately owned parcels on what is essentially a large hilltop. Our team in 2019 was significantly larger. We were double what we had been in 2018. 19 incredible, hardworking volunteers. 1 happy, much more confident archaeologist after the experience of the previous summer. as with France, incredible host and accommodations. Very fortunate to have met and interacted with an eyewitness to the original crash incident, and also benefited immensely from friendly, supportive local agencies and community members. Much like in France, the people in Belgium were extremely happy that we were there. They were very, very supportive that we were there, and really on board with what we were trying to do. Our goals and project plans for the Belgium case were a little bit different. We wanted to survey and map the site, of course, and refine the boundaries of the site. But rather than going and excavating all of the crater right away, like we had done with the stone case, we first wanted to do some more test excavations to try to assess the nature of the site, determine potential areas that might be more valuable or useful for doing excavations. And that involved a lot more of our time and a variety of different survey methods and techniques. The primary reason for doing that is because we were really trying to correlate the site with the MIA service member. That had not been done yet. And I don't know if it's been done even to the present. But that was a major goal of this project, was to actually establish a correlation between this crash site and the MIA service member. So we needed to spend more time doing survey work, doing test excavations to try to establish that association. And then, of course, if possible, try to recover more probative materials as well. Our excavations in the 2019 were comparable. However, we did a lot more small, what we call shovel testing and test units. A lot of these were dug by hand. And you can see a couple photos of that process and operation here. This was done to try to, again, examine or map out the distribution of any crash incident related materials that might be at the site. And then after that, we dug some larger test units by hand to create another machine access corridor to allow the machine to come in and do some excavations in and around that crater. The excavations were adjacent to the impact crater. And then after that, we started on the north half of the impact crater, both to search for probative materials and then to really try to examine and assess the stratigraphy at the site. Stratigraphy refers to the layers or ordering of different strata or geological deposits that we encounter at archaeological sites. It's another fairly common and important practice in archaeological research to understand not only how archaeological sites were formed, but to also learn more about how they have been transformed or modified since they were created. The last thing we were able to do was some hand excavations in the south half of the crater and then areas immediately adjacent to it. Much like with the stone mission in 2018, all of the excavation units that we dug were dug into sterile soil. Once we could demonstrate that there was nothing else associated with our site or the crash in any of the excavation units we dug, we stopped digging, we filled them back up. Our excavated soils were again screened using the very similar methodology to what we had used at the stone case. And then, of course, field assessment and documentation of all finds, just like we had done for the previous case as well. I can't really discuss what we found. As I said, this case is still ongoing. What I can tell you is that this site was absolutely enormous compared to the stone site. We found material widely distributed over a much, much larger area. That's what the map is showing here. It was very, very diffuse, but the deposits, the soils in which we were finding archaeological materials were quite shallow. They were never more than about 3 meters thick. So that's about 10 feet or less everywhere, including in the crater. And elsewhere, the further away you moved from the crater, generally the shallower the archaeological deposits got. What you see on this map is a distribution of different places, different areas within this enormous site where we found archaeological materials associated with the airplane crash. We also did recover a fairly significant quantity of potentially probative evidence. which again was transferred to DPAA Central Identification Laboratory. To my knowledge, none of it has been definitively correlated with the incident yet. We were planning to return to Belgium last summer in June of 2020. Of course, that was delayed because of the pandemic. Right now, we are hoping to be able to resume our excavations at this site in the summer of 2021. Excuse me. So I just want to briefly compare these two recovery missions to try to highlight a couple of things that I and some of our other team members have learned about actually going out and doing the archaeology. Obviously, even with these two examples here, we're talking about different cases, different places, different people, and different planes. There are lots of sources of variation when we do these recovery missions, even when we're talking about the same, broad geographical area of Northern Europe and looking for crash sites from World War II aircraft. They're not all the same. There's a lot of variation. There are different types of site formation processes, different types of transformation processes, different things, activities, and events that resulted in the creation of the archaeological sites, and then different things that have happened to them in the 75 years since they were created. Because of this, what we've had to do is develop slightly different approaches, different strategies. We've had to learn to be flexible, to adapt to different conditions based on where we are and what we're doing. Obviously, overall, we have the same goals, regardless of where we are. We are trying to recover the remains of our fallen heroes. We have similar field methods in as much as we do surveys, we do excavations, we sift and sort through everything that we find, we document everything that we do. And we also have the same reliance, I would say dependence on our dedicated, hardworking volunteers, especially some of our student and former student volunteers. These are some of the hardest working people I've ever met in my life. People like Tori Tiedemann, pictured on the right of your slide here, one of our student, or now a former student, but student volunteers. People work their tails off every day that we're out here, and that's similar regardless of where we are. It also provides the same unique learning and service opportunities for our students. In the process of doing this, our students learn a lot about a variety of different things that we think are going to be valuable to them throughout their lives and in their future careers. And I'll touch on that more in conclusion. The project, UW-MIA project, really does provide experiences for our student volunteers in a variety of different fields. I've already mentioned some of these: history, genealogy, archaeology, forensic anthropology. We're hoping as we grow, biology. And these recovery missions, of course, also provide them with hands-on experience in archaeological research methods. I mean, some of our student volunteers want to go on and become professional archaeologists or forensic anthropologists. They want to actually do this in their career, and this provides an incredibly unique and valuable experience for them to learn how to do this. It also teaches them problem solving and leadership skills, the value of volunteerism, especially service to others, particularly our fallen heroes. And in doing this, what we're really trying to do is help to train the next generation of Wisconsin's leaders. And we're very confident that they will utilize some of the skills they gain through this project and exemplify the Wisconsin idea, not only in their careers, but in their communities, in their own families, and throughout their lives. We've got a lot of future goals, thanks largely to the efforts of Chuck and many of our volunteers. We are working feverishly and successfully so far to expand our partnership with the DPAA. We are particularly interested in trying to focus on known MIA from Wisconsin. In fact, our team has already done a tremendous amount of archival and historical research to not only identify over 1,500 known MIA from Wisconsin since World War II, but through database management and analytics, they've been able to actually start mapping out where these individuals come from, where in the state they come from. And in doing that, we're hoping eventually to be able to expand our recovery operations and missions to focus on these Wisconsin MIA with the aid and support of the state legislature. And we're actually had some incredible developments in that area prior to the pandemic, and we're hoping that at some point we'll be able to resume that as well. Helping fulfill our nation's promise to bring our missing armed service members home to their families has been the most rewarding and valuable experience of my career. It's hard for me to really talk about this sometimes without getting very emotional. I didn't mention this, but I will in closing, that when we were in Belgium in the summer of 2019, we work hard, as I mentioned, but at least one day a week, we try to rest, take a day off, and we'll often go and visit, historical sites, World War I, World War II sites. And in one of those days, we went to the Ardennes Cemetery, which has a very extensive list of World War II American personnel who are missing, unaccounted for. And when those individuals are accounted for, when they are recovered, the cemetery places a small bronze rosette next to their name. While we were touring that cemetery that day, we found that Stone, who we had found the previous summer, had received one of those rosettes. And most of the team that was with us that day had been with us the previous summer. And it's not an exaggeration when I say this. Everybody bawled. I mean, we all lost it. There's nothing more powerful, incredible, or rewarding than knowing that what you're doing is helping to bring a fallen American hero home, to honor their memory, and to provide closure to their families. This is why we do what we do. This is why it's so valuable and important. If any of you are interested in volunteering, donating, or just want to learn more about the DPAA or our project, I've got some great resources here for you. The DPAA's website is fantastic. You can like them on Facebook. Here's their Facebook handle. You can follow them on Instagram. Got some great Instagram images as well. Our website, which I probably should have mentioned earlier, is right here. We also have a Facebook page. You can follow us on Facebook. And if you ever want to talk or learn more about what we do, especially on the archaeology side, here's my contact information at the bottom of the screen. Thank you all very much for your time. I'd be happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
Thank you very much, Greg. And if you'd like to ask a question, you can unmute. You can also show your video and go ahead and ask Greg a question. We'll also be watching in the chat. So.
I am very impressed with the extent of work in that new site. I will be very interested to hear about that one next time.
I will be very interested and excited to come back and tell you more about it when we're done as well.
Greg, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi. First of all, you started by your talk by acknowledging and thanking our heroes and team members. I just want to take this opportunity to thank you and acknowledge you for your hard work and dedication. And beyond that, I do have a couple of questions. I'm curious, in your talk, you very wonderfully illustrated how these recovery missions can contrast with other forms of archaeology. You talked about CRM and more academic and research-oriented kinds of projects. I was curious if you could comment on another aspect. So can you envision down the road at some point how some of these recovery missions might also dovetail with more research questions, where we might have historical reconstructions that are also part of the project goals? So I'm thinking about battlefield archaeology in particular and related areas of research, how non-probative data could have implications for site formation processes for historical and modern contexts. Do you see the potential for that kind of combination in the future?
Absolutely, yeah, I do. And in fact, I am aware that several of the other DPAA partner institutions, academic institutions, particularly those that have been working towards or already developed official field schools out of these kinds of recovery missions, have been successful doing that. The issue of being able to do more kind of problem-oriented, research-driven questions with these kind of recovery missions, I think there's a lot of potential in terms of site formation processes in particular. Aircraft crashes are not all the same. There's a lot of different, variation in the ways that planes crash. And so I think that would be a great area for potential future research. And in fact, there is already research being done in this area as well. So it's not like it's something brand new that we would do, but I think that we could definitely contribute to it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nam.
Sure.
Oh, go ahead.
This is Terry. I just want to thank you, Tom, and Greg for a very fitting seminar on this Veterans Day, and again for your extensive work, Greg. Two questions, if I may. How are these digs financed? You mentioned volunteers. Are those volunteers from the U.S. or are they volunteers from the native country? And then a second, more detailed question, I guess, when you talk about remains of a person, of the pilot or the military person, can you be more specific for us without sounding macabre? I mean, soft tissue and flesh are probably disintegrated by now, is that correct? So are you referring to bones, bone fragments, or am I not correct on this? Thank you.
Very good questions. Let me try to address your first question first. These are financed through partnership with the DPAA, and we conduct the recovery missions essentially on a contract with them. I'm not privy to the specifics of how that process works. That's actually falls under more of Chuck's purview. But in terms of the volunteers, when I refer to volunteers, I'm referring to American student volunteers who come with us. And many of them come from either UW-Madison or other UW system schools. We hope in the future to be able to expand our partnership and hopefully partner with academic institutions and volunteers in the countries where we're doing our recovery missions. I haven't been able to do that extensively yet, but that is one of our goals. To your second question, and probably the more interesting one, those remains can take a variety of different types, different forms. Occasionally, there will be cases and instances where soft tissue is preserved. Generally, in the types of cases that we are dealing with, World War II crash sites in Europe, that's not the case. So usually what we are getting are oftentimes very small, sometimes extremely difficult to identify other biological remains, not soft tissue. And this is part of the reason that the difficulty in being able to recover and identify these lots of times is a big part of the reason why they ultimately go back to the DPAA laboratory for final identification and analysis.
Thank you.
On the chat, Veronica Church is asking, quote, I was just wondering, you mentioned bringing on of forensic archaeology. Would this include crash analysis of the planes? Is this already incorporated currently? My apologies if I missed this.
Forensic archaeology does include more detailed analysis of the circumstances leading to the plane crash, the types of different incidents and patterns that different crashes would create, but it also has a lot to do with understanding how the material that is recovered got to be where it is when we find it. One of our team members, who I mentioned earlier, Dr. William Belcher, is a forensic archaeologist. He's highly skilled at this. It combines both traditional forensic methods of analysis from anthropology, basically crime scene investigations with kind of more archaeological driven research questions and approaches. And I should have mentioned, I completely forgot, but our project has recently formed a partnership with Dr. Belcher at his new institution as well. So we're looking forward to future growth and interaction between our institutions, not only to increase our research capacity and capabilities, but also to provide even more opportunities for students.
Great. Thank you, Veronica, for the question. Other questions from other folks?
I have a question. I'm a volunteer. I've worked for a couple of years with the group. And this may be more for Chuck than you, Greg, but you mentioned remains that are already buried in U.S. cemeteries. For instance, Lieutenant Stone, you found the rosette on his, or it was placed on his robe. I guess it's the DPAA has these, what they call X files, that are descriptions of those remains, where they came from, whatever pertinent information they could gather for that. There was some halt on getting that kind of information. We weren't able to get that after a while. And I was just curious if there's any update on getting that, because that would be helpful in some of the cases to have some of that information.
That, unfortunately, I can't confidently speak to, but perhaps Chuck or one of our historical or archival team leaders could. I don't know if that's something we should be talking about on camera or not, but I'll defer. I'll defer to Chuck on that if he's still here. And
Yeah.
if Chuck's not here, I would say you could probably email him about it too.
Okay.
Yes, we can talk offline on that.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Other questions for Greg?
I had a question. How important is DNA in identifying the remains, and what happened before you had DNA analysis for identification?
That's a very, very good question. I am, full disclosure, not expert in DNA, but I have been doing archaeology long enough to tell you that DNA is extremely important when it can be found, when it can be extracted, when it is preserved. It is extremely important, especially in these types of cases. When DNA is not possible, or prior to systematic, consistent DNA testing, there were other kind of more traditional forensic analytical methods used. For instance, one of the things that we need to first do if we find potential remains is determine whether or not they are indeed bone or not. And then after that, we need to try to determine whether or not those bones come from humans or they come from other animals. And there are methods of analysis that forensic scientists in particular can use to make those distinctions. Dental records were commonly used in the past, other kinds of military records that might help assist in the identification of an individual. And then there are also non-biological types of materials that we can use to try to assist in identification too, some of that other probative evidence that I was talking about earlier.
Does anybody go back to identifications that were made prior to DNA and may have been questionable and reassess them?
I do not know that for certain. I would imagine that they probably do, but I can't speak to that confidently. I think that would probably be a question. I don't know if even Chuck knows that. That'd probably be better for DPAA. Chuck, do you know anything about that by chance? Not to put you on the spot here, but.
No, I do not.
Thank you.
Yep, sorry, I can't answer your question more.
Thank you, Kathleen. Other questions? I'm looking in the chat, and if anybody wants to ask questions directly, that'd be great. I'd be delighted if Bill Belcher come in. If he can give us a little comparison, for example, to the work that these cases are in, say, northern France and in Belgium compared to some of the work that he's done in, I'm going to mispronounce the name, but Palelu and the Plow. Bill, if you can help me pronounce those, because I only read the names, I never pronounce them.
Oh, Palau and Peleliu.
Thank you. Are there particularly difficult things with tropical conditions compared to the temperate conditions of France, or other things that you'd want to let us know about in comparing Pacific versus European theater?
Yeah, actually, when we look at some of the islands, it just depends on whether it's a volcanic substrate or whether it's coral. And so we actually have a really high level of preservation of bone. And even in some of the places I worked at in New Guinea, when we're at 8,000 feet, we're in a saturated environment. It's anaerobic, it's muddy, and then the mud is saturated with the aircraft fuel. We do have a high level of soft tissue that's preserved. And we even saw the same thing in a bog that we were excavating in England. And it was so much preservation of soft tissue and muscle tissue on the bones. And I don't mean to be too macabre, but the police thought it was a murder investigation initially. And then that's when we got called out, and we went out there and assessed it. And the preservation was so good that we found huge wads of pound notes from World War II, coins, leather, gloves, paper that were his parachute log, and things like that. And so it was quite an interesting case that, but the level of preservation, even within Europe, varies depending on if it's a saturated, muddy environment that gets saturated with this aircraft fuel. It does help preserve things that we don't normally see. And and it also has to do with the substrate. So I suspect in some areas of France where you do have a limestone substrate, you would get better preservation of some of the bones and things. So when we were excavating sites in Vietnam, we get a lot of, the soil is extremely acidic. So if the bone is burned, which it usually is in a very high impact, fast impact crash site with a jet, the bones don't preserve if they're not burned because of the acidity of the soil. And so there's a lot of other characteristics. And, to go back to what Dr. Kim was talking about, these are some of the kinds of things I think that will make really good taphonomic processes to look at sort of different kinds of, post-depositional changes to sites, and look at more scientific and more goal-oriented or more research-oriented archaeological work.
Great, thank you very much, Bill. It's quite a comparison and contrast with the types of soil, the pH of the soil, anaerobic versus aerobic. That's astonishing stuff. Lawrence Winkler has asked, are there detailed reports associated with these recovery missions? In particular, any history of the mission and goals and history of the person? Greg, would you like to address that?
I'm happy to, although I didn't know that that Bill was with us. Dr. William Belcher was with us, and now that I do, I kind of feel like he should just answer all these questions since he's been doing this for 25 years. But and he is one of the world's foremost experts at this, so I'm really glad he was able to join us. But I can address this question. Yes, we do write reports after we complete our recovery missions. Those reports are submitted to the DPAA for their review, for their approval. In the case of an incomplete or an ongoing excavation, they're usually submitted and kind of classified as an interim or a summary report. After a case is closed, and that usually is when we've either excavated it to its full potential, there's no reason to do any more work there, or we get a positive confirmation, then we will compile and write a final report that goes to the DPAA, and then is also made available to the family members of the recovered MIA person.
Great, thank you very much, Larry, for the question, and Greg for fielding it. Other questions?
I have another question, if I may, please.
Absolutely.
This is for the benefit of students who may be online with us. You mentioned that your volunteer program might be available to students outside of the UW program at some time. How likely is that to happen, and what could we do to find out more about that? If there are other private colleges in Wisconsin who have who has a good anthropology program, how might they be involved in this as a volunteer?
So I'm going to turn this over to Chuck again, if he doesn't mind. The only thing I will point out is that we have already had some student volunteers from outside of the UW system. Miss Ella Axelrod, who is currently a graduate student of Dr. Belcher, was with us for all of our recovery missions. She went to, I'm going to screw this up, Colorado State or Colorado College, I think maybe. And then we've also had a couple other.
Yeah, Colorado College. It's the super tiny college out in Colorado Springs.
Okay, good. Thanks, Ella. So the point is we have had some, and I think we are interested in definitely, you know, you don't have to be a UW student to do this. I'll turn it over to Chuck, though, if he's still with, to maybe kind of explain how that process works, or how you want to recruit volunteers, student volunteers.
Yeah, typically we have the student reach out to us and send us their CV so we can get a better understanding of the background and what the goals are that they wish to achieve from participating with the project. One of the difficult things is we have many volunteers and there are many individuals who want to participate. So it's a really hard process of selection. We do have 2 missions coming up this summer, hopefully pending COVID, that we're working on, and have them just reach out to us. I think a number of our students probably can answer these questions better than I can because they've experienced it.
Thank you.
I would just personally say the pictures from Belgium looked a lot more pleasant than some of the ones from Bouchier, Chuck. At 12 feet of clay, wet clay mud always makes me smile, and it looked like it was a little drier there in Belgium. Other questions? Go ahead.
Tom, I was actually going to make one more statement, and thank you, Alicia, or Alicia, for pointing that out. Please note that it doesn't mean that the student has to be an anthropology archaeology student. Not all of our volunteers have an anthropology or archaeology background, nor a historical background. Some can be in the business school or engineering school. It's truly what the end goal is for them for participating that helps us decide who to select. Thanks to Alicia.
Thank you, Chuck. Any other questions or comments? If not, I want to thank Gregg again for splendid talk. It's great for me to get to see how the other 2 sites looked and how they're different from the Fazekas site. And I appreciate coming on tonight. It's great to be able to have a talk like this for Veterans Day. And to all the folks who have been on the program, who've been part of the MIA program, I see a lot of familiar names in the participants list. Thanks again for all the work that you've done over the 4 or 5 seasons to make this happen, and look forward to I hope everything looks favorable for the summer of 2021. And with that, I'll say thanks again. Next week, we're gonna have Scott Lothus. He's with the Center for Railroad Photography and Art. He's going to talk about how railroading and railroads, that technology has been recorded by artists, including painters, watercolors, photography, video. His center is right here on Monroe Street. It's about 7 blocks from where I'm sitting right now. My grandpa was employed by the Burlington route for his adult life, and this is a warm part of my heart to get to see how we're going to be able to talk about the technology and development of railroads next week. So for tonight, thank you again, Gregg, for the talk, Chuck for all the work in leading the MIA program, and for all the folks that are tuned in. Really appreciate it. See you next week, I hope.